Well, good afternoon. My name is Dave Nagel, and I'm really excited to have a chance to meet all of you virtually here during this initial webinar. I'm hoping there's a chance later today. Kimmy and I talked that there would be a possibility of after the different groups. I don't know if you're watching as a large group or at different schools, whether you're at Lahanatan, hope I pronounced that correctly, EC Best or Numa. But after this session, sometime this afternoon, possibly have a conference call where I could call in. I wasn't available during this time, but I will be later this afternoon. But really excited to share with you an overview of some pieces that I call personally a framework that I put together for several years called Impact Professional Learning Teams. Another way to look at PLCs or data teams. And so this is something that a chance to introduce it now. I think there's a good chance I'm going to be working with you coming up this November 4th and then possibly again in December. So I'm going to jump right in, and this is designed to be sort of a small workshop, small seminar, as if I was in the room. And so throughout the webinar, I'll try and throw in probably a joke or two that won't really work. And if it doesn't work, if I tell a joke, I just want everyone to know if you don't laugh, all that means is I've just told a time-released joke. Hopefully some folks in the room were laughing. You have to remember I'm recording this by myself. But all joking aside, I'm going to set this up as if I'm in the room. So there'll be times when I ask you to pause the recording. You have your working handout with you to complete an activity or a short reflection. And I will leave it up to who's ever in the room to kind of gauge when you want to continue, if there needs to be some whole group discussion that the teams elaborate on. I know you might have done some work today already looking at some NWA results or your literacy plans. And so this might have a chance to tie some of those things in there. So I did my best to try and gear it to some of the things that I know are happening already in Churchill County. But you know better than I do when it's an appropriate time to pause the recording. But please use this as if I was in the room and it's a seminar. It's a chance for you to have some active learning, not just to sit and watch for 20 or 30 minutes. But I'm going to start off with kind of wrapping up the summertime and getting into the fall seasons. And we might have functions and pumpkin rides or activities where you're out and about. Someone says, oh, you're a teacher, you're a principal. What are the hot topics in education? So as a group, I'm not in the room, but somebody kind of collect them. What are some of the hot topics? Hopefully you're shooting them out now and sharing things like Common Core. I hear a lot. Funding, technology, one-to-one, very popular as a topic in a lot of school districts, including where my children go. Obviously, we're keeping an eye on bullying. Testing always comes up. Merit pay. Next generation assessments. I think you probably listed many others. My question to the group, and I wasn't there, so I don't know for sure, but how many of us said student learning? I'm guessing the room just got a little quiet there. And if it did, it's similar to when John Hattie, Professor John Hattie, who a lot of us know now his visible learning research, which is really profound, and he has synthesized over 50 years of educational research around what really has worked to increase student learning. The first time he posed that question to me, I did the same thing maybe some of you did. Maybe some of you said student learning. I wasn't in the room, I'm not sure. But quite often in large audiences, that is not what comes up first and sometimes doesn't come up at all. And everything we do in our schools needs to be focused on, are we having the best impact on student learning? And that is not the same as student achievement. We have students at any of our grade levels from kindergarten up through fifth grade that might be achieving, might be above the bar that the state of Nevada has set for them, but they're not learning, they're not growing. We could have students that are 2 or 3 grade levels behind at Numa. Maybe they're a 4th grader and they're only on a 2nd grade level, but they're making huge gains in learning. And if they continue that, they're going to catch up sooner rather than later. And that's actually something we could miss. And so part of what I want to talk to us about today as we think about our collaboration Fridays and what we do with them, is it focused on what we are doing as the adults to make sure we're impacting student learning at the highest levels? And I'm hoping not as much today. Today I would like to just provide an overview, but when we get together, what are some practical strategies and protocols so we can be as productive as possible during our collaboration meetings, but really focus in on some essential pieces at times that might pull us away from larger tasks, but really hone in to make sure we are really isolating what do students need to go to that next level and to begin to own their learning more. So a little bit about me. I will be very honest. My background as a practitioner initially was at the secondary level. I taught in a district that was a very large district in Indiana. I was a middle school science teacher for 8 years and then a middle administrator in the same district. But I've been doing this work now for over 12 years, and twice I've been certified in John Hattie's visible learning research. Visible Learning Plus is sort of the professional development that goes along with that. But I will say I've done a tremendous amount of work at all grade levels, K-12, across the country in PLCs and data teams. There's a colleague of mine, actually two colleagues, Dr. B.R. Jones and Carl Kloss, that are coming out with a publication next spring called the PLC Reset. And I'm going to highlight a lot of those pieces here in this process that we're going to talk about around how we take that professional learning community model and make sure we're getting the right learning out of it, the learning for the adults. Have published one book and a couple more on the way. I will tell you, as elementary teachers, the only reason why I wrote a book initially and called it secondary grading is because secondary people aren't as smart as elementary teachers, and they won't read it unless it says secondary on it. I'm going to change the cover, and it's going to be some of the same things. My standard joke when I work with elementary or high school teachers is high school teachers will complain about all the prep time they don't have. And then I say, but when you're late from your prep coming back to your classroom, it's not like in an elementary school when if you're late picking up the kids from specials, one of your colleagues just might slash your tires. I'm hoping that got a laugh out of the group because I get it. I understand what it's like to live in an elementary school. But all joking aside, the amount of collaboration time in elementary schools is sometimes less. Now, what's powerful when we're looking at what we're doing at Churchill is it's in a setting on a Friday where the students aren't there and we have Collaboration Friday. So I do want to mention I've done a tremendous amount of this work in Lyon County, in Humboldt, and some in Elko, Ely, and Esmeralda. So I've spent a decent amount of time in the districts that I think really represent the state of Nevada. I think Clark County, as most of you might imagine, is almost its whole different entity compared to the districts I've listed here. And I'm representing, when I work for you, a little company called NZJ Learning. Now, what does NZJ Learning stand for? Well, it's really not too complicated. But when I had to form an LLC, I didn't know what to call it, so I made it real simple. So this right here is Nicholas. He's my oldest, and that is Zachary and Jacob. So it was a really easy way to come up with an LLC. It's just my three boys. And I will tell you that when I work with schools, one of the things that John Hattie's visible learning research has taught me, and I'm going to share this as we talk about what we're doing in our PLC settings, but he's just finished fifth grade. He's in the sixth grade now, so he would have left Numa after this year. But when he comes home, I never ask Nicholas what he learned. It's too easy for him. I say, what feedback did you get today? Because if you didn't get any feedback, it's his fault. And his job is to get back to school tomorrow and get some doggone feedback. The teacher has 120 students. He needs to be able to know where his next learning step. Now, the teacher has to provide that for him in the form of success criteria and places he can go to guide his learning, but it is his job to seek feedback. But I asked these two guys a very different question. When they come home, that's a preschooler who probably could have started kindergarten on the left, Zachary's in first grade, and to be honest, we wanted them 2 grades apart, separate conversation. But when they come home from school, I ask them a very simple question. I say, what mistakes did you make today? I want them to learn early in life that making mistakes is a good thing. One of the things John Hattie's research in this visible, the science of learning, very profound study found that children at this age, so the teachers pretty much at Lahontan and EC Best, and certainly it doesn't mean the Nuba teachers are excluded from this, but the study was pretty much K3, found that when students at this age, what is more impactful for their life is that they love their early primary teachers more than their early primary teachers are the most stellar and amazing. The reason for that is they develop a schema early in life to feel safe making mistakes. We have to get away from the notion that 100% is the goal. Now, there's only 26 letters in the alphabet. There certainly are some closed skills. But after that, we shouldn't make perfection the only option, and anything less than perfection means you have failed to some degree or not gotten it all right. We need to teach our students that making mistakes is a path to error and that it's a good thing and that they learn from their mistakes. They need to learn from them and do something different the next time. But I'm only sharing that because while I'm not in an elementary school on a daily basis, I feel like I am. My joke would be to whoever the first grade teachers are, ask how many students you have on a daily basis. You have probably a number around 22 or 24, and I say, how do you do that? Because I have one first grader in my house named Zachary, and that's more than I can handle. But I live in an elementary world in my house, and certainly I work with a lot of elementary audiences across the country, especially around this process. And I'm going to highlight some of those pieces more specifically when we come together shortly here at the 1st of November. One of the comments I always like to share with teachers is that we're united by one thing. Across the country, worldwide, we're all time poor. No matter how much financial resources we have or what type of resources our school has, none of us ever have enough time. Well, one of the things that Churchill County has done is made an investment with your Collaboration Fridays. That's an investment of time. That's taking time away, instructionally in a sense, to provide what should happen, and that the teachers have a chance to come together and learn from each other and develop themselves and have some professional learning take place. So I want to ask you to take a moment, and you see in your working handout, this is why I'll ask somebody to pause the recording. And I really want to ask everybody to do this individually. It'll take you no more than less than a minute. But jot down some quick thoughts. From your perspective, from a classroom teacher's lens or an administrator, what would you say is the main benefit of Collaboration Fridays for you in Churchill? So take a moment, get some ideas down. Everybody jot down their own ideas before they share. And now I'm going to respectfully ask whoever might be in charge, have the ability to pause the recording, do so now, please, and then have a 3 to 4 minute discussion. And those of you that are leading the group, whether it's the administrators or anyone else, you determine when folks need to come back together. And if you want to have some whole group sharing, please do so. I'm going to pause my recording momentarily and then move on. But please pause the recording now and share some of your thoughts around reflection question number 1, the main benefit you see of Collaboration Fridays. Welcome back. I would assume that you've completed the reflection, had a chance to share some thoughts, and that's why you've brought the recording back on. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. But please know that I'm assuming that you took as much time as you needed to complete each one of these reflections or activities, however long you needed to do that. So here's a question I want to pose to the whole group. Are your PLCs, your professional learning communities, on Collaboration Fridays, your data teams, whatever our term is, are they having their greatest possible impact? And I want to stress, meaning they're having the greatest possible impact on student learning. That the actions that take place on Friday, then when the teachers come together and they might look at evidence and collaboratively score work, I know that's been done a lot, and your literacy plans that are a big driving force. Do the actions and strategies that we come out of there, are they impacting student learning at the highest level? And so I want to push us into a couple more thoughts and then get you back into a little bit of a reflection. But what does the L stand for in PLC? I'm hoping and assuming there was some chance from the group that it was learning, professional learning community, absolutely. But who's learning? Because it's not the students. The L in the PLC stands for no one's learning except the adults. The term professional learning community is not synonymous with education. It means a group of professionals are going to come together and learn about their craft and make decisions and have dialogue for meaning making and discussion to make decisions about what actions to put in place for themselves. So the L is to make sure, the L stands for the adults learning. So the teachers have to be learning, the administrators have to be learning. If we're learning, we will change our practice in the right way. And of course, by default, we hope to see student learning. But the L in PLC is not for student learning. The L in impact professional learning teams is not for student learning, it's for teacher learning. I want to highlight something, and I think this is really important for us to think about, especially from the administrator lens with the teachers that are in the room. This comes from Michael Barber's work, and it's pretty simple, but it's also profound. We learn anything in life trying to get to that green level, trying to get to that plateau. We learn really fast so we can get to the comfort zone, to where it's effortless. For example, this is why we work with our students to learn their math facts. So 2 times 3 is 6, 5 times 7 is 35. So that way students don't waste time processing that and they can move on to the next piece. We don't want them to struggle with their alphabet over time or struggle with their noun-verb agreement, subject-verb agreement, whatever that is. But there's a little bit of a myth that when we try something new and we move to a higher skill, that there's just an implementation dip. That's true to an extent. But when we're trying something new and we're learning something new, we can't be as productive if we're processing. We can't be learning and producing. I want to kind of challenge everybody. I'm guessing by the end of the day, and the fact that it's Friday, we're probably going to be headed in our cars, maybe to the local watering hole to get a Diet Coke, which will accompany our margarita or beer or whatever it is because it's Friday afternoon. But we're going to get in our car and we're going to drive. And most of you who will be driving this afternoon will do 10 things in the first few minutes as you're driving that you're completely not consciously aware of. But you were very aware of the first time you started driving. And if you don't think I'm telling the truth, how come we always turn the radio down when we're lost? pointing in my head because we need our processor. So my point is, especially to the administrators, but also to the teachers in the room, when we go through a cycle or an impact learning team cycle, there's times when we have to take time to complete the protocol and times when we have to stop and learn. If we're learning about a new piece in the curriculum, if we're trying to design our assessment before we implement it, we're learning some new standards. So part of the process has to be when we look at how our Collaboration Fridays will go is, and maybe this is in place already, and I'm not assuming in any way, shape, or form that it's not, but there's some times where we're going to administer assessments, we're going to put them on the calendar, look at the evidence, our NWA scores are going to come in, and it's going to be an analysis type day. Not that we're not learning then, but then other times we're going to be focusing on our own learning, new strategies, thinking about the impact, thinking about if we execute that strategy, what should we see in terms of changes in student results? Not just that they'll get a higher score, but that would really impact their phonemic awareness. That would really impact their number sense. That would really impact their text close reading that they can apply in some writing. So I really want us to realize as we go through anything in school, we need time to learn. And not everybody's going to need the same amount of time, whether we're 15, 5, or 50. So when we look at learning, all of us should be striving to get to as many green lines as we can before we move on to those higher skills and realize when we do, there's going to be a lag in productivity when we're processing. One just kind of overarching piece around research, and it's not to hit us with this at this time, but we can't dig into our educational evidence on a deep level and really let it drive some thought. So very few PLC studies are deeply vetted, meaning that they're not included in a lot of empirical studies because sometimes there's just too much bias involved. If any of your administrators did some research on your Collaboration Fridays and included their thoughts, their opinions, can't do that. It has to be somebody else who's monitoring your evidence. So what Vesio and her team at Florida State found, and they combed the studies, and they were actually only able to include about 11 deep scale dissertations. They found that when PLCs, Collaboration Friday teams, have the traits of they set goals, they share values, they have a collaborative culture, they get along, they have positive relationships. That leads to about 36 variance in pedagogy and over 85% change and variance in achievement. So the question has to be, many teams have situations where they have shared values, they set goals, they get along, they have positive relationships and come nowhere near those levels of changes in practice or changes in achievement. So the question then has to be why. So I want to give you a chance to have a second reflection question. You see it detailed on your handout as well. From your perspective, what's the biggest challenge you feel that impedes Collaboration Fridays from being as useful, productive, and fruitful as the last piece on your working handout? I apologize that it got cut off here. I'm going to pause that and fix that. But take a moment and just like last time, with your peers, before you work with your peers, take a moment and in your working handout, here we go, we got it back up. And we're back. Apologize about that. Just the formatting on the slide. Take a moment now before we turn everybody loose and just jot down reflection question 2. What is the biggest challenge you feel impedes Collaboration Fridays from being as useful, productive, and fruitful as they could be from an administrative lens, from a teacher lens? Everybody take a moment and jot down your ideas, and then we'll give us a chance to share in a moment. But please, everybody take time to get their ideas down. 1 or 2 sentences, a couple bullet points. From your perspective, what might be impeding them from being as successful as they could be? Not saying that they're not successful now. Excellent. I'm hoping and assuming everybody had a chance to get an idea or 2 down. At this stage, I'd like to turn it over to who's ever in charge of the webinar. Folks need another minute, to jot some ideas down. Please do so, but pause the recording here and have some reflection, shoulder to shoulder. Let individuals have a little bit of dialogue in their close groups, and then do whatever you need to do if you want to come together whole group. I'm going to pause the recording briefly, but then move on. So please complete your reflective dialogue now around reflection question number 2. Welcome back. So, again, I'm assuming that you had a chance to share some things that might get in the way of collaboration. And I'm looking forward to hearing what some of those were. For now, I'm not going to assume, but I'm wondering if some of the pieces I share in the next second half of this webinar might have addressed some of those. But What you see here is the very simple impact PLT process, and it has simple 4 steps. So we're going to come back to these steps in much more detail during the next webinar. I do have one little piece that I'm going to have you read shortly. Step 1 is we'll chart and examine the evidence. I want to stress, I didn't use the word data because there's student results from NWA assessments. There's classroom assessments. There's also exit tickets. There's also student voice. When we're asking students, how do you know what you learned, and how do you know what you're learning, and how do you know if you've learned it? That can be a piece of evidence that also gets embedded in the cycle. Then we formulate inferences into student learning. Any quality assessment will come down to 3 points: purpose, evidence, inference. We have a purpose for any assessment, any test, and then we need to look at our questions. Did our items garner enough evidence, quality evidence, to make a quality inference? When you're driving to work in the morning, you probably have a purpose to get there on time and maybe to stop at your local coffee shop. And you want to do both. And you realize as you go to the coffee shop, there's 15 people in line and there's just no time to do it. You make a decision because to meet your purpose, you've gathered some evidence to make an inference that you're not going to be able to do that, and you make an adjustment. Once we look at that, we'll determine specific adult actions and strategies, and that's where we'll be really intentional. One of the things far too many PLCs do is come together to plan activities for the students. What I mean by that, it's not that the students won't be doing something. They will be working on problems or writing or whatever that is, but only after there was some instructional piece put in place. And then we'll determine if those actions and strategies had an impact on learning, because we'll look ahead and establish success indicators. If that strategy works, we should see fewer of our students struggling with their eighths in multiplication. We should see fewer of our students needing as much help and support when we get into fractions. Now, some teams, some collaboration Fridays, you might complete all 4 steps. Other Fridays, you might focus as much as anything on 1 or 2 of the steps. But I'm going to push us a little bit to say where would we be in any type of our collaboration Fridays and not be in one of the places. Because if we are collecting and putting together our literacy plans, well, that's determining action and strategies. If we are collaborative scoring work, that's where we would probably be charting evidence or even formulating inferences into student learning. So I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but I want to stress that the things we are doing in Churchill should line up into these 4 steps that are easily adaptable. We'll talk more about that because it's not about following a specific form when you come together. Certainly, we've got templates and documents and forms of that nature, but it goes so much deeper than that. But impact PL teams are small, grade level, department, course alike, or organizational teams that examine student learning from work generated from a common formative assessment or utilize a common scoring guide. So we're going to need to look at over time, what does our common formative assessments look like? How often are we using some of the same assessment tools? Or is it possible at any level where the scoring guide is the same, but what we're doing with the scoring guide could be different? We have a scoring guide for a generalized reading passage. One teacher's using one passage, one teacher's using the other, but that scoring guide would help us assess both. So again, just as a little bit of a broad overview, and there could be grade level, course alike, but then that organizational team. We could have a 1, 2, 3 math team that's looking at how are students progressing in math in 1, 2, and then when they move into EC Best School, because we would want to know if they are consistent learners within the district. Is there a time that they could come together and look at the results from 2nd grade when they leave and come to another building? So there's a lot of possibilities here, and if we're all using the same framework, we have a better chance to maybe make some of those decisions when we are passing our students. That I heard her, for the most part, we're always going to have mobile students, but for the most part, exist in Churchill and go from 4 to 5. Go from 3 to 4. So again, there's a lot of ways that an IPLT could exist. Most of you will live on the same one most of the time, but there's times when you could be on different teams, maybe not at the exact same time, but that's where we could look at the schedule for when certain teams might meet. There might be an organizational team that focuses just for the incoming 4th graders as they start a new school and then branches off a little bit into maybe some of the 4th grade math or 4th grade language arts. I'm not exactly sure the current structure, but these will be things that we'll be talking about and what has been working and maybe what could work better or what needs to stay as is. They're collaborative, they're structured, and they're scheduled. And I think that's something that we're going to talk a lot about between now through a couple of webinars we come to back in November is how do we schedule our meetings to where we earmark certain meetings for when we're going to analyze assessment results. So if we're going to analyze assessment results that we've administered, not just an NWA one that we know when that's coming, but let's say we determine a grade level assessment and we want to use an upcoming Friday, well, then we need to have that assessment administered at least maybe by Monday. And then the results are due by Wednesday. So that way we come to that meeting with our results charted. We come to that meeting with everything done, not scoring, finalizing then, so we can be as effective during that 90-minute period. And again, they focus on the effectiveness of teaching and the impact of the teaching on the student learning. I'm going to walk us through now two final pieces, and this goes back to when I shared a little bit ago the four elements that have so much of an impact on professional practice and PLC impact when we have shared learning and goals and values and things of that nature. There's 5 core elements that really drive professional learning teams. Common challenges, relational trust, what we're going to call collective efficacy, teachers having the right amount of freedom to act and be empowered, but what drives that efficacy is their own learning and positive interdependence. They use authentic protocols, and there's perpetual adult learning. More than anything, the adults are consistently learning about their craft. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, and this is where I'll ask the leaders in the room to help kind of organize this, is with one person, with a partner, and please go with just one person. And if you're sitting at a table, you kind of turn your chairs. I didn't want this necessarily to just be a table discussion. Sometimes it's more powerful for 5 or 6 minutes for 2 people to read something and just have that one-on-one dialogue. But with a partner, please read and discuss the overview of these 5 core elements of impact professional learning teams on page 2 and 3, and then complete the reflection. So you see that in your handout. It should take folks about 7 minutes or so to read, 3 or 4 minutes to complete the reflection, have a little bit of dialogue. This would be a good time to pause the recording. Please, everyone, take a moment and read through those 5 elements on pages 2, 3, and then complete the short reflection. Short paragraphs about each, and then I'm going to walk through them just a little bit more detail after you come back. I'm going to assume now you're pausing the recording. I'm pausing my voice just for a few seconds, but when I come back, I'm going to assume you've taken the 10 or 12 minutes to complete this activity. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to complete the activity, have some reflective dialogue, and hopefully someone in the room was able to facilitate maybe even some discussion around these 5 core pieces. I want to just speak briefly to them and kind of guide us into this last part of the webinar. But when teams develop a common challenge, and what I mean by that is we're not just going into Unit 1. We're not just going into the next chapter. When they develop a common challenge that will guide their passions and their efforts towards having the greatest possible impact. What I mean by this is we're going into a unit on nonfiction reading, but we're really going to focus on characters. We're really going to focus on setting. Or in 3rd grade, we're really going to focus on students really coming out of this unit, really having a strong grasp, no matter what, of their math facts. That doesn't mean we're not teaching the other aspects, but that would drive the types of remediation and enrichment that we do. Because far too often, we have students that are going to be going through school where there's a great deal of conceptual learning. Main idea, for example, many concepts in science, concepts in social studies such as war and battle and things of that nature. Conceptual understanding happens over time. Procedural understanding needs to happen in mass with then practice spaced out. So this might be an opportunity for teams to unite so that way when they are examining evidence on a Friday, they're not examining everything. They're not trying to be all things to all students for all standards. They're determining what is most important. Football teams at all levels, but even your high school football teams, will probably go into a game on Friday with some common focus areas. We're going to really try to stop them on 3rd down. We're going to play field position, which means we might punt, even though we could go for it, but we're going to play field position. So there's a challenge that's driving their actions. Same thing with a PLC or an impact PLT, and we're going to talk about how developing those that should come from your school improvement plan. And so your literacy plans that you've developed, this will be a great place to dig in there and go, what are some challenges for the next few weeks? Doesn't mean we're abandoning other pieces, but we're going to focus more on those learning elements with our students and maybe hone in be really precise with some decisive instruction with some students, and others are kind of moving forward. They might not completely have it, but they certainly don't show the huge gap that others might have. Must have a degree of relational trust, and we'll talk more about this, but teacher trust happens by doing the work. And I don't know anything about the teachers in your buildings, but I just know in many schools across the country, far too often, we can exist in a team of nice. And I'm not saying that we should be in a team of mean, but if I was on one of your Impact PLT teams on a Friday afternoon and I brought my assessment and I showed it to the team and maybe several folks didn't really care for it, and I said, what do you think of my assessment? I'm not quite sure what you folks would say, but often the standard response is, oh, Dave, I think it looks great. Now, I'm not going to say this out loud. I wouldn't use it, but I think it looks great. We have to develop the kind of trust with each other where we're going to challenge each other. We're going to want them to challenge ourselves. And that trust develops over time. And we're going to talk more about how we build that in with some activities and just some look-fors as we're going through the work. Joyce and Showers and Brick and Schneider's research, though, was fascinating. Out of all the Chicago schools that made a turnaround in the late part of the 2000s, the first part of the decade of the century, the only commonality between the schools that made turnarounds and those that didn't was deep levels of relational trust within their PLCs. There were business-like conversations with everyone, and they were challenging each other in the right way around the work. Didn't mean they couldn't still be friends, didn't mean they couldn't still go out and have a beer on a Friday or anything like that, but the meetings were business-like, and that was what ended up being one of the commonalities of the schools that made huge gains in their work. Next one is having consistent protocols, and I'm only showing you one here. I'm going to introduce more when we come together, but here's a protocol. On a consistent basis, we're following these 4 steps, and as I mentioned earlier, doesn't mean every meeting will hit all 4 steps. But I certainly want to say this is a protocol if I'm on a kindergarten level and I've charted the evidence of students who identified their sounds, made some inferences into what blends they're struggling with. We put an action in terms of how we're going to have them work on their sounds. And then we determine what some indicators would be if they're starting to do better with their PH or some other sounds. We could take a look at our school-wide evidence and how all of our students did in reading, writing, or math. Formulate some inferences to say, as a whole, our students are struggling with reading comprehension, but mostly with text analysis. There's going to be our 3 or 4 specific strategies that'll take place every day in reading block and the professional development that will go with it. And here's places to measure success, both in some common assessments, but in NWEA and how we're going to monitor that. My point is I just walked through quickly and verbally how from a kindergarten level or a whole school, this process wouldn't have to change. And so part of what I'm excited about is some intentional time and scheduled time to work just with the administrators so they have a grasp of what this looks like, not only for them, but then down to the teacher level. So there's no incongruence in terms of how we're kind of formulating our plan as we use this protocol. So last activity, I'm just going to have you take a moment and just at your tables, just pause the recording for just a moment and read through the 4-step protocol in a little bit of detail of Impact professional learning teams. Just like before, who's ever in charge, just take a moment, pause the recording, 4 or 5 minutes, just read through the 4 steps, have a short table talk about with what you see, have any longer dialogue you need as a whole group, and then bring me back on the recording. But I'm going to assume you're pausing it now, and we'll talk back in just a few minutes. So as a small group, read through Impact Professional Learning Teams 4-step protocol, quick overview. Welcome back. As always, I assume that you've taken the time to complete the activity, read through those 4 steps. Nothing real profound. Hopefully you've maybe done this with a partner, but if you did it with a small group on page 6, that's fine. At this stage, I just wanted you to have a chance to read those 4 steps, what you see between what happens in that formulating inferences into student learning or establishing success indicators, any just chance for you to have a quick reflection of what that looks like. And again, we're going to come back to this in much more detail. Last thing I wanted to talk about related to processes that we have to put in place. And I wasn't in the room to hear when I asked the question, what might get in the way or impede some of the ability for your PLCs to be as successful as possible. And I use a metaphor similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need food, shelter, and safety to survive. If we don't, we literally won't survive. But just because we're eating doesn't mean we're going to survive past that level or get to any degree of self-actualization. We can use the same metaphor in a PLC. We have basic professionalism. We're on time, we're prepared, we're respectful. Then we have behaviors that engaging behaviors that contribute. I don't know what they all are, but I know one is that if we're stuck looking at our cell phone when another colleague is trying to share, or we're checking our email, that's not really a level of engagement. So we're going to talk about next time, what are some basic instructional norms? Now, there's a difference between a standard and a norm. And far too often, schools come in with the norms of we're on time, we're prepared, we're respectful. That's why we get paychecks. That's basic professionalism. And I want to share with you a district, and I'll be happy to send this to you in some more detail. Carlisle Community School District, just southeast of Des Moines. Been doing a lot of this work there, and they actually used the data team process and kind of molded it into my graphic metaphor with the hierarchy of needs. What you see here is they have 5 levels of collaboration during any collaborative time, or if it would be your collaboration Fridays. The first thing that they did, and I've kind of heard that this maybe isn't as big of an issue in Churchill, but they addressed heavily basic professionalism. They were going to attack that and just simply stop the meetings and not have it. People need to be prepared. Use technology appropriately. Not quite sure there's any standards or assessments that are written on Facebook pages. There might be, and that was a joke, and I hope somebody laughed. But in all honesty, if we're going to come together and meet, we need to respect each other's time, and so that was addressed. After that, teams are challenged at the end of every meeting, and this is what I'm going to encourage and kind of walk us through, a protocol after each collaboration time on Friday to spend the last 5 minutes going, where are we? And not that we have to use their hierarchy. Maybe we develop our own. But in Carlisle, if the teams aren't at a level 3 at least, they should have some discussion as to why. Why didn't we get to the 5 guiding questions? Why didn't we get to those things? Oh, we kind of started late. We had kind of a weak agenda. We got off task. Anything less than a 3 is just simply not acceptable. And that's where they have to be able to say, okay, how can we get better? Because the 3 is the minimum. Now, when we look at that probing instructional dialogue, where we're being transparent and reflecting on strategies and coming with solutions, that's where most teams will want to live. That skilled instructional dialogue, that's when it's just so transparent and it's so simple and so fluid throughout the whole meeting. Teams will visit there. They won't live there. Not that you can't visit there a lot, but that takes a lot of effort, time. It has the assessments to be strong. It has to have all the norms and protocols and organization to be in place. But it's nice to have a place for our teams to measure where are they and where do they consistently get to. And so now as a team of teachers, they're empowered to determine why aren't we getting to that level? Or if we are, what are we doing well that we want to make sure we replicate and don't fall back on? And again, this is just one example of many that I'll share that certainly you're welcome to use and adapt, but certainly I wouldn't encourage you to adopt it, meaning make it designed to Churchill, make it designed to EC Best, make it designed to your school. But certainly if you see a model here and you like that, there's no reason not to take what's there and adapt it. But maybe this is something we would think about. And now at the end of a collaboration Friday meeting, everybody's asked in their teams to go, where did we get to today? And then why? And then how can we get better? And lastly, in that framework is IPLTs must focus on learning, not teaching. Measurable improvements in student learning only occur in PLCs or IPLTs that focus on changing instructional practices. So this is where we have to say, what's our strategy first before we ever talk about what the students are going to do? Of course, the students are going to write their paper, do their math facts, whatever that is. But only after there's been a change in instruction that might not always just be, well, they need to practice more. Maybe they need some guided practice. Maybe they need some modeling. So again, we will get more into that, but this is a place that I want us to think about. And got several tools and instruments that I'm going to provide teams to kind of give a once over to their current practice. But we're really focused on the learning of the adults for the learning of the students. Because we could teach something, but learning doesn't really take place with the students. And then we got to go, well, did teaching really take place? So we'll dig into that one much more, and I think most of us would agree to that. The final last piece I just wanted to share is that when we think about, and I've kind of talked a lot about IPLTs, a little bit of the protocol, the structure, the need for organization, but really at the end of the day, we need 2 practices. We need quality formative assessments and a PLT process that's of quality. We need the adults organized, in a business-like mode with some protocols to examine evidence. But if the evidence from the formative assessments isn't of quality, we would make some poor inferences. At the same time, if we had these amazing assessments that were telling us exactly what we needed to know about where our students' learning needs were, what their next steps were, but we didn't have a structure in place to analyze them, we didn't have the protocols in place, we didn't have the adults behaving in a manner that was going to help them be productive, we'd fall short as well. So it's really not an either or, and it's really not what comes first. It's really a chicken or the egg. There is something in a lot of the evidence and research, and certainly the districts I've worked in, is that when we get the IPLT structure solid, it's easier to go back then and look at the formative assessments and make adjustments there. Not that we couldn't do it the other way, but once that structure is in place for how we collaborate and what we use, it makes it a lot easier for any adjustments in formative assessments to take place a little bit easier. And final points, I mentioned this earlier, any quality assessment comes down to these 3 points: purpose, evidence, inference. So I want us to think on this last part, what are some of the assessments that we're using and what's the purpose of them? What is it supposed to be telling us about what the students had learned? And it can't be where we're just looking at the 80%, because 3 students might get an 80% and they might have 3 different learning gaps. So we have to dig in. Whoops, I'm going to go back here. Lost a slide. Assessment is about inference making. Teachers use test results in order to make inferences about their students' cognitive status. Once those score-based inferences have been made, the teacher then reaches instructional decisions based at least in part on those inferences. Educational assessment revolves around inference making. James Popham. James Popham is by far the world's leading expert in assessment. He's in his mid-80s, but if you know him, but if you met him, you would think he's in his mid-60s. His first research review of educational assessment literature involved the years 1886 to 1917. He's forgotten more about assessment than I know I'll ever know. And his simple statement here: once those inferences have been made, the teacher reaches instructional decisions, at least in part, on those inferences. So we're going to need to look at the assessment results to drive the inferences. So the last thing I'm going to have us do as a short read is the foundations of assessment literacy. So on page 5, I've just pulled 6 foundational statements. I only listed, sorry about that, I had a fast clicker there. 6 statements around the foundations of assessment literacy. Some of them were reprinted here from Larry Ainsworth's Rigorous Curriculum Design. With a pair, just take a moment and read through these 6 statements. From know your purpose, determining the assessment type, etc. And then there's a short reflection at the bottom of that page. For the final time, whoever the leader in the room is, this is a good time to pause the recording, have everybody read through these 6 statements, have an individual jot down of a reflection, then maybe a shoulder reflection, and then maybe a whole group. And then you see at the bottom, how do these overarching 6 statements get you to think, maybe right now, how it aligns with what some of the assessments you're using in your classroom and then also on Collaboration Fridays? How might it get us to think differently or raise some more questions? I'm going to pause. I'm going to go ahead and come back here in just a moment, but assume you took as much time as you needed for this final activity. Welcome back. So again, I appreciate everyone who was in charge of kind of guiding the group or pausing the conversation when need be. The last thing I wanted to share, very last point, if you've gone through sort of those pieces around the foundations of assessment literacy, is just another seed planting to think about as we begin digging deeper into how we could design our assessments to use in our Impact PLT process and our Collaboration Fridays. There's really 2 kinds of pre and post assessments. The first one is a mere pre-assessment, where we pretty much administer the same pre-assessment and the same post-assessment. And we might change the story or we might change the problems, but it's predominantly the same skills, same standards. And when we do that, we could easily implement a SMART goal in terms of specific, measurable, ambitious, relevant, and timely. We want a number of students that are here to grow to here, etc. There's also the differentiated mere pre to post assessment. And this is where I would have to push some thought. If we give pretty much the same pre and the same post, but we have a student that positively aces the pre-assessment, would we give him or her the same post-assessment? And if the answer is yes, because we want to make sure they know it, then I'm going to challenge, as we should, that the pre-assessment was of quality. Because if we weren't sure if they got it right, if it was quality, then we shouldn't make decisions if they got it wrong. If we have a quality pre-assessment and students nail it, it would probably be safe to say, as we did earlier, that we're struggling with time, that we shouldn't invest the time to have that student take that post-assessment. We might need a differentiated post-assessment, which, yes, I understand that will take a little bit more time, but this is what happens in our PLC process, so we're prepared when that happens. And I think all of us know what's going to happen, maybe not very frequently, but that's how we can differentiate a pre to post. One of the things I just wanted to plant this seed, because I'm going to talk about it when we come together, and we think about as we design our assessments for use in our PLC process on Fridays for this IPLT structure, of what we might call a like pre to post assessment design. And what happens then is I'm going to think, going into a unit, what's a foundational skill or a foundational set of skills? Then that's going to be in my pre-assessment. It could be math facts. It could be number sounds. It could be blends. I could be having the students getting ready to write an argumentative paper in 5th grade. I need to make sure they know what an argument is. After that, it's kind of irrelevant. They either know argument or they don't. My point is I'm really looking early on at a foundational skill that if they have it, they have a really good chance to be successful. But if they don't, I'm going to have to stop and intervene. But that is a very short, concise pre-assessment. It almost tells me pass or fail, gets it or doesn't. I can't then compare pre to post. So in that situation, I can't implement a SMART goal. And that could be very well okay. And I really want to challenge us not to have this by default mirror pre to post assessment all the time. At the same time, to have a like pre-assessment with just foundational skills all the time. I'm not sure either. But I would challenge that we have more of an opportunity to make some real decisive instructional adjustments early in a unit when we think more around the foundational skills that kids need to have, and maybe they should have them and it should have been taught in a previous school or previous grade level. Okay, fine. If they did, great. But if they didn't, then we need to maybe intervene sooner. So then, if you see on the right side, well, then what I can still compare is perhaps Unit 2 to Unit 3, because there was some conceptual understanding that built from one unit to the other. And I might not look at the entire assessment, but we really were looking at main idea and figurative language in both units. We really were looking at math fractions and how they go into division. There could be some skills or concepts that actually hit multiple units, so we can still look at that place for growth or comparison, but we're doing it for the right reasons. We're not just trying to compare pre to post each unit for the sake of doing it. And I'll highlight some examples very much when I come, where at times schools have set, PLCs have set, data teams have set SMART goals, where really it was to get students to go from 68% to 80%. And all that really meant was a handful of students got one or two more items right. And really there's no guarantee that there was learning that take place as much as it might have been osmosis. And so that's where we want to be really intentional with making sure that we're not writing goals just so we can reach them, but we're focusing on how can our assessments drive practice. John Hattie would say the only reason we put pencil and paper in front of a student for an assessment is so we know what to do next. When you go to your doctor, he or she doesn't give you a bunch of tests and then assess you. Just the opposite. They assess you first and then determine what tests you actually might need. So again, what I was trying to do here was just plant that seed and get us to think about some of the things we have done in the past. What does this get us to think about now? So final reflection question, and I'm just going to finish the webinar here in a moment, but some overall thoughts related to viewing this webinar, specifically the last piece on pre and post assessments. Who's ever in charge, I don't know how close you are on time, but please pause the recording as long as you need for this final question. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on and complete the final slide, so that way if you wanted to move on, you could, but this could be a chance afterwards just to have a short whole group debrief. What I wanted to show here would just be cautious, because I'm not just telling you to think outside the box. And I wish I was in the room, because I'm hoping I would hear laughter, because this is supposed to be funny, just to end on a joke. Because I'm hoping today I've challenged the thought a little bit. As we go through the process, it's probably going to do that a little bit. But there's that point in time where we have to be cautious and saying we're just going to do it the same way we've always done it. That doesn't make sense. we're just going to change just for change's sake doesn't make sense either. It's usually somewhere in the middle. So I'm hoping this was useful and productive in terms of getting you thinking about some ideas around some of the work we're going to begin to engage in, and done so with a broad brushstroke to allow some reflection questions, and hopefully we'll perk up different kinds of questions at a K-1-2 building than we would at a 4-5 building. Looking forward to seeing everyone on November 4th. Any questions at all? And again, there's a chance, I don't know at this stage when I'm recording the webinar, but there's a good chance we might come back later this afternoon on a conference call if it works. I would be very excited for that. But there's my email, davenagelvl+@gmail.com. There's my Twitter handle, and there is my website. Feel free to check that out. But please, if you have a question, and we're not going to get a chance to talk today, or we do, don't hesitate to shoot that out to me. And I'm very excited to touch base with everybody here in just about 6 weeks. So have a great weekend, and I look forward to talking to you soon.